When successful businessman James Carter lands at JFK Airport after a trip to Paris, he expects a smooth return home. But instead, his luggage mysteriously vanishes. At first, it seems like an unfortunate mistake until he notices he's not the only one. Something isn't right. Before he can push for answers, customs officers detain him. Accusations fly, and suddenly, James finds himself in a dangerous game he never signed up for, one designed to make people like him disappear. But James isn't just any traveler. He fights back. And as he digs deeper, he uncovers a dark conspiracy, one that's far bigger than lost baggage. How far will they go to silence him? And can he turn the tables before it's too late? Find out in today's story. Make sure to subscribe for more stories with twists you won't see coming, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. James Carter stepped off the first-class cabin of Air France Flight 227, stretching his stiff muscles after a long flight from Paris. As he adjusted the cufflinks on his tailored navy blue suit, he scanned the airport terminal. New York City. Home. He strode towards baggage claim, expecting a quick retrieval. That's when the first warning sign appeared. The conveyor belt was moving, suitcases tumbling down in steady intervals. Families reunited with their bags. Travelers grabbed their belongings, and within minutes, nearly everyone had collected their things except for him and a few others who, James quickly noticed, shared one thing in common. They were all black. His jaw tightened. Coincidence? A stocky customs officer, badge shining under the airport's fluorescent lights, leaned lazily against a pillar. His name tag read, K. Reynolds. The smirk on his face as James approached already set off alarms in James's head. James cleared his throat. "Excuse me, my suitcase isn't here. Black leather, monogram tag. Could you check the system?" Reynolds barely glanced at him before giving a shrug. "Not showing up, sir. Might be lost in transit." James's eyes narrowed. "Then let's check the cameras." Reynolds chuckled, a slow, deliberate sound. "Unfortunate timing. Systems. Down today. Maintenance." James knew a lie when he heard one. He took a deep breath. "Stay calm." "All right, then who do I speak to for an official report?" Reynolds exchanged a glance with a colleague before pointing across the hall. "Try the claims desk." James turned and marched toward it. But when he reached the desk, the woman there barely looked up before mumbling, "We don't handle missing luggage here. You need to go to the secondary office in Terminal B." James frowned. Terminal B was on the opposite side of the airport. "The officer just sent me here." "Well, he was wrong," she said flatly, already waving the next person forward. "A runaround." James exhaled sharply. Fine. If they wanted to play games, he had time. He started toward Terminal B, his polished shoes clicking against the tiled floor. That's when he heard it. A man's voice, light-hearted and friendly. "Sir, that's your suitcase, isn't it?" James spun around just in time to see a white businessman strolling past security, wheeling a black leather suitcase, identical to his own. James's breath caught. Impossible. Without thinking, he strode toward the man. "Excuse me," but before he could get close, a firm hand clamped down on his arm. "Reynolds." James turned, eyes burning with disbelief. "That man has my bag." The officer's grip tightened. "Sir, step back." James clenched his fists. "I have my luggage claim ticket right here. Let me prove it." Reynolds smirked. "Sir, calm down. You're causing a disturbance." "A disturbance?" James gritted his teeth. The other man was walking away with his property, and he was the problem? Reynolds lifted his radio. "We've got a code 47. Passenger is becoming aggressive." Code 47? What the hell was that? Before James could demand an explanation, two more officers appeared from the side corridors. A setup. James raised his hands in controlled frustration. "I just want my bag." "Sir," Reynolds said, voice smooth with false authority, "you're under suspicion of carrying illegal contraband." We need to detain you for further questioning." James's stomach dropped. This wasn't just about a suitcase. This was something bigger. And now he was trapped in it. James Carter stood frozen, his mind racing. Suspicion of carrying illegal contraband? It was a blatant lie. Yet Officer Reynolds delivered it with the ease of someone who had done this before. James steadied his breath. He knew better than to react with anger. It would be exactly what they wanted. "I'd like to speak to a supervisor," he said evenly, keeping his hands visible. "And a lawyer." Reynolds chuckled. "Oh, we'll get to that. But first, we need to take this conversation somewhere more private." The two additional officers flanked James, cutting off any potential escape. Travelers in the terminal slowed down, some glancing curiously at the scene, but no one intervened. No one ever did. James could feel the heat rising in his chest, but he forced himself to remain calm. He had done nothing wrong. "Fine," he said, jaw tightening. "Let's go." The officers led James through a restricted corridor, past security checkpoints, and into a small, windowless interrogation room. The walls were bare, the fluorescent light overhead buzzing faintly. They left him standing by the metal table while Reynolds took his time settling into the chair across from him. One of the other officers, a taller man with sharp blue eyes, remained by the door, arms crossed. Reynolds exhaled dramatically, flipping open a folder. James Carter, 42, CEO of Carter International. Quite the jet-setter, huh? James said nothing. He had read enough about wrongful detentions to know that every word he spoke could be twisted against him. Reynolds smirked at his silence. "You fit the profile, you know. Expensive suit. First-class seat. Returning from Paris. We've had plenty of cases like this before. Smugglers posing as businessmen." James let out a slow breath. "This is ridiculous." Reynolds shrugged. Maybe not. We got an anonymous tip that a passenger matching your description might be carrying illegal substances. You wouldn't mind if we checked your luggage, would you?" James clenched his jaw. "You lost my luggage, remember?" The tall officer by the door let out a quiet laugh. Reynolds leaned forward. "You sure about that?" And then, as if on cue, the door opened. A third officer entered, holding James's suitcase. For a split second, relief washed over him until he noticed that the zipper had been broken and the contents had been tampered with. His heart pounded. No, this was too easy. Reynolds dragged the suitcase onto the table. He slowly unzipped it and flipped it open. James's neatly packed clothes had been thrown into disarray. His toiletries were missing. His business documents, some of which contained confidential information, were crumpled at the bottom. And then came the final act. With exaggerated care, Reynolds reached inside and pulled out a small, clear plastic bag filled with white powder. James felt the world slow around him. They planted it. He took a sharp breath. "That's not mine." Reynolds tilted his head. "That's what they all say." James's fingers dug into the edge of the chair. He had seen enough cases like this. Black traveler falsely accused, framed, forced into plea deals to avoid long sentences. This was a setup, and they were expecting him to panic. Instead, he forced himself to sit back, arms crossed. "I want my lawyer, and I want this tested immediately." Reynolds studied him for a long moment. Then he laughed. "Oh, don't worry. We'll get it tested. But first..." He nodded at the other officer. Before James could react, the man grabbed his arm and yanked him out of his seat. Metal snapped around his wrists. Handcuffs. James's stomach twisted. "This is illegal and you know it." Reynolds grinned. "Welcome to America, Mr. Carter." And with that, they dragged him out of the room, handcuffed and framed. James knew this was bigger than a lost suitcase. Who set him up? Why him? And most importantly, how do you fight back when the system is rigged against you? Can James turn the tables before it's too late? The cold metal of the handcuffs dug into James Carter's wrists as the officers dragged him down the dimly lit hallway. The walls were a dull shade of gray, the kind designed to make people feel small, powerless. But James refused to shrink. "Where are you taking me?" he demanded, keeping his voice steady. Reynolds, still smirking, didn't bother looking back. "Holding cell. Until we decide what to do with you." James clenched his jaw. "Decide what to do with me?" The arrogance in those words confirmed what he already knew. This had nothing to do with justice. This was a power play. They turned a corner and entered a secured area with reinforced steel doors and no windows. A heavy-set guard sat behind a desk, barely glancing up as Reynolds flashed his badge. "Processing him for narcotics possession," Reynolds said casually. The guard nodded, uninterested, and buzzed them through. Inside, the air was thick with the stale scent of sweat and disinfectant. A row of holding cells lined the far wall, occupied by a few unlucky souls, mostly men of color. James inhaled deeply, forcing himself to stay calm. He would not let them win. Reynolds stopped at an empty cell and unlocked it. "In you go." James didn't move. "I want my phone call." Reynolds chuckled. "Oh, you'll get it." Eventually, James took a step forward, refusing to be intimidated. "You know this won't hold up, right? That evidence won't survive an actual investigation." Reynolds leaned in, voice lowering. "You think anyone cares? You think a judge will listen when all they see is another rich guy who thought he was above the law?" James held his gaze. "You made a mistake." Reynolds raised an eyebrow. "Yeah? And what's that?" James leaned in slightly, his voice sharp as steel. "You picked the wrong man to frame." For the first time, Reynolds' smirk faltered. But before he could respond, another officer entered the room, a woman with sharp eyes and an air of authority. Her badge read Lieutenant Sloan. "What's going on here?" she asked, eyeing James and then the officers. Reynolds straightened. "Routine narcotics possession. We found, save it," Sloan snapped. "I just got off the phone with legal. This guy's lawyer is already making noise." James lifted his chin slightly. "Finally." Sloan crossed her arms. "Let's process his call now. If there's an issue, we'll handle it by the book." Reynolds hesitated, then forced a smile. "Of course, Lieutenant." James followed them back through the corridor, feeling the shift in control. But as they reached the phone area, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Not even close. What happens when James digs deeper and uncovers something even more dangerous? The landline phone was old, its cord twisted from years of neglect. James Carter sat in the small, sterile room, his wrists still sore from the handcuffs they had only just removed. Across from him, Lieutenant Sloan stood with arms crossed, watching him like a hawk. "You have one call," she said, voice firm. "Make it count." James picked up the receiver and dialed a number he had memorized years ago. It rang twice before a deep, authoritative voice answered. "This is Mark Ellis." James exhaled, tension easing just slightly. Mark was not just any lawyer. He was a high-powered defense attorney specializing in cases of wrongful arrests and systemic corruption. And more importantly, he was a longtime friend. "Mark, it's James," he said, keeping his tone controlled. "I need you at JFK Airport. Now." A pause. Then, what happened? James shot a glance at Sloan, who hadn't taken her eyes off him. He chose his words carefully. "Customs lost my luggage. Then they found something in it that wasn't mine." A sharp inhale from the other end. Mark understood immediately. "Sit tight," Mark said. "Say nothing. I'll be there in 30. James hung up and turned to Sloan. "Now." "What?" She studied him for a moment before nodding toward the door. "You wait." James was led back to the holding area, this time to a small interrogation room rather than a cell. A dim bulb buzzed overhead, casting flickering shadows on the gray walls. He sat at the metal table, fingers tapping lightly against the surface. Minutes stretched into an hour. No one came. They were stalling. James leaned back, forcing himself to think. Why frame him? Why now? This wasn't just casual discrimination. This was deliberate, orchestrated. Then it clicked. The missing business documents. James was returning from a major investment deal in Paris, one that would have expanded his company's presence internationally. His suitcase had contained confidential agreements, financial projections, and competitor analysis. Could this really be about more than race? Could it be corporate sabotage? The door creaked open, interrupting his thoughts. Reynolds walked in, still wearing that smug expression. But this time, he had a file in hand. Reynolds dropped the file onto the table and slid into the seat across from James. "You're in a tough spot, Carter." James didn't respond. He knew the game. Reynolds flipped the file open, pulling out a document. "This is the official report. If you sign this admitting that the substance in your luggage was an unintentional possession, we can work out a deal. No jail time, just a fine and a flight ban for a few months." James scoffed. "You must be joking." Reynolds smirked. "It's better than the alternative." James folded his arms. "Which is?" Reynolds leaned forward, voice low. "We press full charges. Drug trafficking. That carries up to 15 years. James met his gaze, unflinching. "And what happens when the test comes back proving that wasn't mine?" Reynolds gave a slow, mocking nod. "That's the thing, Carter. Sometimes tests take a while. Paperwork gets lost. Judges get overwhelmed." He leaned back. "Meanwhile, you sit in jail. Weeks, maybe months, waiting for a case that might not even make it to trial." James clenched his fists under the table. This wasn't about justice. It was about breaking him. But James had built his career on knowing when to push back and when to turn the tables. He took a deep breath. Then he smirked. "You really don't know who you're messing with, do you?" For the first time, Reynolds' confidence wavered. At that moment, the door swung open. Mark Ellis strode in, his presence shifting the entire energy of the room. And just like that, the game changed. Now that James has legal firepower, can he expose the truth before it's too late? Mark Ellis was a man who didn't need to raise his voice to command a room. He was dressed in a crisp charcoal suit, his salt and pepper hair neatly combed back, and his sharp eyes locked onto Reynolds the second he stepped inside. The smirk on Reynolds' face flickered, just for a moment, but James caught it. He wasn't expecting a fight. Mark dropped his briefcase onto the metal table with a decisive thud. "James Carter is leaving this room. Now." Reynolds chuckled, regaining his composure. "Not so fast, counselor. Your client is under investigation for." Mark held up a hand, cutting him off. "Save it. I already spoke with the district attorney's office. Funny thing, they have no record of an official arrest." James stiffened. No official arrest. That meant there was no case number, no paperwork, nothing legally binding. This wasn't just corruption. This was off the books. Reynolds folded his arms. "We're still processing." Mark tilted his head. "Really? Because from what I see, my client is being detained without charge. And you're attempting to coerce a false confession." Reynolds smirked, but James noticed the slight twitch in his jaw. "We have probable cause." Mark didn't blink. "Where's the drug?" "Test result." Silence. Mark's voice dropped to a near whisper, but it carried enough weight to freeze the room. "You planted it, didn't you?" Reynolds didn't answer. Mark nodded. "That's what I thought." He reached into his briefcase, pulled out a legal document, and slid it across the table. "Here's what's going to happen," Mark said. "You're going to release Mr. Carter immediately, or I'll file an unlawful detainment lawsuit faster than you can make that smug little smirk disappear." Reynolds leaned forward, hands pressed against the table. "You think you can scare me, lawyer?" Mark smiled a cold, knowing smile. "Oh, I don't have to scare you." He gestured toward the two-way mirror on the far wall. "I'm sure the airport's legal team is watching this conversation right now, deciding if your career is worth protecting." Reynolds stiffened. Mark continued, voice even. Let me guess, this isn't your first time pulling something like this, is it? How many other travelers have you shaken down? How many lost bags have ended up being auctioned off? Reynolds' fingers curled into fists, but he said nothing. Mark tapped the table. I suggest you cut your losses and walk away. Because once we dig into this, you won't just lose your badge, you'll be facing charges of your own. James could see the conflict flashing across Reynolds' face. The man was calculating his next move. Then, finally, Reynolds scoffed and leaned back. Fine. He turned to the other officer in the room. Uncuff him. A moment later, the cold steel around James' wrists was gone. He exhaled slowly, flexing his fingers, but his mind was already racing ahead. This wasn't over. Reynolds hadn't backed down out of fear, he had backed down because he still had an angle. And James needed to find it before it was too late. Mark gathered his briefcase. Come on, James. Let's go. James stood, straightening his suit. As he followed Mark out of the room, he could feel Reynolds' eyes burning into his back. And then, just as James stepped through the doorway, Reynolds spoke. Enjoy your freedom, Carter. James stopped. Reynolds grinned. For now. A chill ran down James' spine. Something told him that this was far from the end. What hidden power is protecting Reynolds? And what will James uncover when he starts digging deeper? James Carter walked out of the interrogation room, his steps measured, his breath steady, but inside, his mind was racing. Mark Ellis strode beside him, his expression unreadable. They passed through a maze of sterile hallways before reaching the main terminal. The moment they stepped into the open, James felt the weight of dozens of eyes on him. It wasn't paranoia. Passengers, security guards, airport staff, they were all watching, some in curiosity, others in silent acknowledgement. James wasn't sure if they recognized him as a businessman or as the black man who had just been wrongfully detained. Either way, he wasn't invisible anymore. Mark guided him toward the exit, speaking low. We need to talk somewhere private. James nodded, but before they could reach the doors, a uniformed officer blocked their path. For half a second, James braced himself for another confrontation. But the man, an older black officer with a neatly trimmed mustache, raised his hands in a gesture of calm. His name tag read Sergeant D. Lawson. I saw what happened back there, Lawson murmured, glancing around before leaning in slightly. I know Reynolds. And I know this wasn't just a mistake. James studied him carefully. Then, you also know I'm not letting this go. Lawson exhaled, then slipped something into Mark's hand. A folded piece of paper. Take a look at that, Lawson said, voice tight. And be careful who you trust. Then just like that, he turned and walked away. Mark unfolded the paper. As soon as his eyes scanned it, his face darkened. What is it? James asked. Mark handed it to him. It was a list of names, dozens of them. And next to each name was a status. Detained, case closed, lost luggage, no recovery, deported. A pattern emerged almost instantly. They were all black. James felt something cold settle in his stomach. This is a list of victims, Mark murmured. James' grip on the paper tightened. No. This is a list of targets. Back at Mark's office, the two men sat in silence, processing the weight of what they had just uncovered. It's organized, Mark said finally. This isn't just discrimination. This is a deliberate operation. James ran a hand over his face. Reynolds isn't smart enough to be running this alone. Mark nodded. Which means he's got protection higher up. James thought about the missing business documents in his suitcase. The bogus drug charge. The casual confidence Reynolds had when he tried to frame him. How much do you know about airport security contracts? James asked suddenly. Mark frowned. What are you thinking? James stood, pacing. Airport security, especially customs, isn't just run by the government. A lot of it is privatized. If someone controls the right contracts, they control who gets flagged, who gets detained, and whose luggage disappears. Mark's eyes sharpened. You think this is about money? James let out a humorless laugh. It's always about money. He sat back down, tapping the list of names. These aren't just random victims. Someone is stealing from them. If we follow the money, we find out who's really pulling the strings. Mark leaned forward. Then we hit them where it hurts. James met his gaze. We expose everything. But how deep does the corruption go? And what will they risk by uncovering the truth? James Carter sat across from Mark Ellis in the dimly lit office. The list of names spread between them like a roadmap to something much darker than they had anticipated. There's a pattern here, James murmured, running his finger down the list. These names, most of them weren't just travelers. Some were business owners, executives, international students, people with resources. Mark exhaled sharply. People who wouldn't just lose their luggage and walk away. They'd file complaints, push back. James nodded. And yet, every single one of them was either silenced or dismissed. Mark leaned back, his fingers steepled under his chin. We need proof. We need records, financial transactions, something that ties this to whoever's really running it. James thought for a moment. Then he grabbed his phone. I might know someone who can help. 20 minutes later, James and Mark pulled into a small diner on the outskirts of Queens. The place was nearly empty, save for a lone figure seated in the back booth, a woman in her mid-40s, dressed in a gray airport security uniform. Her name was Natalie Brooks, and she had worked in JFK's Customs Department for nearly 2 decades. She looked up as James, and Mark slid into the booth. Her expression was wary, but there was something else in her eyes, a quiet anger. You're lucky I even agreed to this, she said, stirring her coffee. If they find out I'm talking to you, I'll lose my job. James met her gaze. Then why did you agree? Natalie sighed, setting her spoon down. Because I'm sick of watching innocent people get targeted. Sick of watching guys like Reynolds act like they own the place. Mark leaned forward. How long has this been happening? Natalie hesitated, then lowered her voice. Years. At least 10. It started small random errors, in luggage tracking, a few questionable detainments. But in the last 5 years, it's gotten systematic. James frowned. How systematic? Natalie exhaled. You ever hear of Tideway Solutions? Mark's eyes flickered with recognition. They're a private security contractor, right? Natalie nodded. They have exclusive contracts with multiple airports, including JFK. On paper, they just handle logistics and screening assistance. But in reality, they run the entire security operation. James felt his pulse quicken. Privatized control over who gets stopped, who gets searched, who gets randomly selected. Mark's voice was grim. So Reynolds and his buddies aren't just dirty cops. They're foot soldiers. Natalie looked around the diner nervously, then pulled something from her pocket, a USB drive. I copied some records, she said. It's not everything, but it proves what's happening. James took the drive carefully. What exactly are we looking at? Natalie's expression darkened. A system designed to make people disappear. Back at Mark's office, they plugged the USB into a secured laptop. Files loaded onto the screen, hundreds of flagged reports, hidden security logs, financial records. Mark scanned through them, his face growing tighter. This isn't just about stealing luggage. This is a revenue stream. James looked over his shoulder. The files detailed an organized operation targeting specific travelers, mostly black and minority passengers, deliberately delaying, detaining, and confiscating their belongings. But what came next made his blood run cold. Mark, he said slowly, pointing at the screen. There, buried among the flagged names, was a file labeled Ghost Protocol Active Cases. They clicked it open. Inside was a list of people who had been permanently lost in the system. James scanned the names, his stomach turning. Some had been deported under false claims. Some had been transferred to federal holding centers on fabricated charges. Others simply vanished. Mark sat back, stunned. This isn't just corruption. James swallowed hard. This is human trafficking. The room fell into a heavy silence. James clenched his fists. They had more than enough proof now. But as he stared at the screen, one terrifying thought hit him. If they had been willing to frame him so easily, how far would they go to stop him now? Now that James knows the full truth, how long before they come after him? James Carter stared at the laptop screen, his stomach twisting into knots. Ghost protocol. The phrase sent a chill through him. This wasn't just about luggage theft or corrupt officers running a side hustle. This was a machine designed to erase people. He exhaled sharply. We have to go public with this. Mark Ellis, his expression grim, closed the laptop and leaned back. Not yet. James frowned. Not yet? We have proof. Mark's fingers tapped against the desk, his mind clearly racing. And that's exactly why we can't rush this. He gestured to the USB drive. If we go to the authorities now, they'll bury this. The people running this aren't small-time crooks. They have power, influence, connections. James clenched his jaw. So what do we do? Sit on it? Mark shook his head. No. We dig deeper. We find the head of the snake, the person running Tideway Solutions, and pulling Reynolds strings. Because right now, we have evidence of corruption. But if we can connect this to the top-level decision-makers, that's how we bring the whole thing crashing down. James exhaled through his nose, forcing himself to stay calm. Mark was right. If they acted too soon, the people behind this would make the evidence and them disappear. And James had no intention of being erased. They spent the next hour analyzing the files. Patterns emerged, travelers flagged for random. Checks had their information altered before reaching customs. Some were rerouted entirely. Others had flight itineraries changed without notice. Tideway Solutions had access to airport databases, which meant someone on the inside was manipulating the system in real time. James tapped the screen. We need someone inside Tideway. Mark nodded. And I think I know where to start. He grabbed his phone and dialed. After a few rings, a voice answered. This is Valerie. James couldn't hear the full conversation, but from Mark's clipped responses, it was clear he was speaking to someone who knew more than they were supposed to. When Mark hung up, he turned to James. Meet me at this address in an hour. Alone. James frowned. Alone? Mark's expression was unreadable. We're being watched. James left the office through the back exit, stepping into the cool night air. He had barely made it 2 blocks when a feeling hit him he was being followed. He didn't look back immediately. Instead, he kept his pace. Steady, listening. A car engine idled too long at a stoplight. Footsteps echoed behind him, just faintly. Then, the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. A black SUV had just turned the corner, a model commonly used by private security firms. His heartbeat quickened. This wasn't paranoia. They knew. James didn't go directly to the meeting spot. Instead, he ducked into a convenience store, grabbed a bottle of water, and casually stepped back outside, doubling back through an alley. From the shadows, he watched as the black SUV slowed in front of the store, waiting. James clenched his jaw. They weren't just watching. They were hunting. He exhaled and pulled out his phone. If they wanted a chase, he'd give them one. What happens when James takes the fight to them? James Carter gripped his phone tightly, his pulse steady despite the situation. They were watching him. They had probably been watching since the moment he walked out of that interrogation room. But James wasn't the type to run. Instead, he played it cool. He walked further into the alley, staying in the shadows. The black SUV idled by the convenience store, its tinted windows revealing nothing. James turned corner and spotted a parked yellow cab. He quickly slid inside and handed the driver a crisp $100 bill. No questions, James said. Just drive. The cab pulled away smoothly, merging into traffic. James glanced through the rearview mirror. The SUV hesitated for a second, then it started following. James exhaled sharply. So, they weren't just watching. They were tailing him. That meant one of two things. They were either waiting for the right moment to grab him, or they were leading him into a trap. James took a deep breath and pulled out his phone, calling Mark. Mark picked up instantly. "Where are you?" "I'm being followed." A pause. "What kind of car?" "Black SUV. Tinted windows. No plates." Mark cursed under his breath. "That's Tideway. They don't usually make their moves this obvious." James clenched his jaw. "Maybe they want me to know." Mark was silent for a moment. "Where are you now?" James looked around. The cab had just merged onto Queens Boulevard. If he kept going, he'd be too far from their meeting point. "I need to shake them," James said. "But I can't go straight to you." Mark didn't hesitate. "Then don't. Head to the East River Docks. Warehouse 17. Valerie will meet you there." James frowned. "Is she reliable?" "She used to work for Tideway." James exhaled. That was either a good thing or a very bad thing. He ended the call and leaned forward. "Change of plans. Take me to the docks." The driver hesitated but nodded. James didn't look back, but he could feel the SUV closing in. The moment the cab pulled into the docks, James knew something was off. It was too quiet. The usual sounds of trucks and workers were missing. The air smelled like salt and rust, but the lot was empty except for two parked cars in the distance. "Keep the change," James told the driver. He stepped out, eyes scanning the surroundings. He wasn't alone. A figure stepped out from behind one of the parked cars, a woman in a black coat, blonde hair pulled into a tight ponytail. "Valerie Carter?" she asked, her voice sharp. James nodded. "Ellis sent me." She glanced past him. "Were you followed?" James didn't answer, because at that moment the black SUV pulled into the lot. Doors opened. 4 men stepped out, and every single one of them was armed. James's body tensed, his mind already calculating. He had walked straight into a trap. Valerie didn't flinch. Instead, she sighed. "Well, this just got complicated." James's fists clenched. Did she set him up? Or was she caught in this just like he was? Who is Valerie really working for? And how will James escape? The cold night air was thick with tension. James Carter stood in the middle of an empty dockyard, facing 4 armed men in dark tactical gear. Their weapons weren't drawn yet, but their hands hovered near their holsters, a silent warning. Beside him, Valerie remained eerily calm. James kept his voice steady. "You set me up?" Valerie sighed, her expression unreadable. "No, Carter. I just didn't expect them to get here first." James didn't buy it. "Then explain why 4 operatives from Tideway Solutions just pulled up like they were expecting me." One of the men stepped forward. Stocky build, close-cropped hair, a scar running down his cheek. James recognized him instantly. "Reynolds." The corrupt customs officer smirked. "I told you we'd see each other again." James felt his pulse slow. Not from fear, but from clarity. This was it. The final play. Reynolds turned to Valerie. "Step aside." She didn't move. "You're making a mistake." Reynolds let out a low chuckle. The only mistake was letting this guy walk out of that interrogation room. He glanced at James. "You should have taken the deal." James exhaled. "And you should have been smarter about covering your tracks." Reynolds' smirk faltered. "What?" James shifted his stance, buying time. "I'm not the only one who has your files now." Reynolds' expression darkened. "You're bluffing." James tilted his head. "Am I?" Reynolds hesitated just for a second. And that's when Valerie moved. In a blur, she grabbed the nearest guard's wrist, twisting hard. The man let out a grunt of pain as his gun clattered to the ground. James didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, driving his elbow into another man's throat. A sharp choke, a stagger back, then James was moving again. Valerie snatched up the dropped weapon and aimed it at Reynolds. "Tell your men to stand down." Reynolds' face twisted in fury. You now? For a moment no one moved. The other two men hesitated, hands still near their weapons. Then the sound of sirens. James felt the tension shift. Mark Ellis had come through. Reynolds cursed under his breath. He knew the game was over. He raised his hand slowly. This isn't over, Carter. James wiped his mouth, breathing hard. For you, it is. Within minutes, NYPD officers swarmed the dockyard. Reynolds and his men were forced to the ground, handcuffed, their weapons confiscated. Mark arrived moments later, looking almost amused. You always did have a way of making things dramatic. James exhaled, finally allowing himself to feel the exhaustion creeping in. Yeah, well, this one wasn't exactly by choice. Mark turned to Valerie, who was holstering the stolen gun. So, are you on our side now? She gave him a dry look. I was never on theirs. James studied her for a moment. He wasn't sure he fully trusted her yet, but she had saved his life tonight. That counted for something. A uniformed officer approached them. Mr. Carter, we'll need you to come in for a statement. James nodded. Of course. As he glanced at the handcuffed figures of Reynolds and his men, a thought struck him. This wasn't just about them. Tideway Solutions was still standing. The people at the top, the ones who had built this machine, were still out there. And James Carter wasn't done yet. Justice had begun. But would he be able to finish it? The battle wasn't over. But for tonight he had won. James Carter refused to be silenced. He fought back and won. But corruption like this doesn't just exist in one airport or one city. How many others have been targeted, framed, or disappeared without a trace? If this happened to you, how would you fight back? Let us know in the comments where in the world are you watching from? And if you want more mind-blowing stories, plot twists, and justice served cold, hit that subscribe button now. You won't want to miss what's coming next.